Adam Crichton is the Washington correspondent for the Australian newspaper, and there's been some big news about troop deployment from the United States to Eastern Europe. Code 4, get ready for Ukraine. And he joins us now from the beautiful city. Great man. I'm sure you're enjoying the heat wave like many are right now. But so
yes,
we're talking here, about the best part of 3,000 troops that are being moved to Eastern Europe. Now, it is a very fine line. One of the reasons why Ukraine is not in NATO is that if that's the case, then basically World War III begins. Why? Because everyone teams up on Russia. Russia's able to call on, among others, China. How close to this is the deployment of troops, though, to basically being exactly the same thing?
Well, look, the US government says that they're just going to Eastern Europe, and we assume not to Ukraine, as the government here has said that it won't do that many times. But it's worth keeping in mind that they've said similar things kind of over the last 500 days of this tragic war about the Abrams tanks, about the F-16s, about the long-range missiles. And then each time they've then gone back on that promise not to send them. So you do have to wonder going forward whether at some point, the government says, look, we just have to send a few troops to Ukraine to help with the weapons or to help train the soldiers or something like that. And of course, as we know from history, that can very easily snowball into something much larger if a Russian missile accidentally kills an American troop or something like that. So look, it is a worry. And just with this story, I thought it was fascinating. I mean, it's a huge story, and it was very little covered in the US. In fact, I missed it by 24 hours, to be honest, and that's just because it wasn't very prominent. And when I read the release, I thought, wow, this is really big. And I think it wasn't that prominent because it's so embarrassing, because a few days earlier you had the president say that Russia had lost the war. 3 times he said that at a press conference in Lithuania, which is an absurd statement, obviously, given that they're sending more troops and they're sending more missiles, and that Ukraine's obviously struggling to break through, quite understandably. So the story didn't get that much prominence, but look, I think it's a huge story, and it's very concerning.
There's also, again, just the mission creep of it all. And I know that Russian talking points, settle down. Look, the West's appetite for forever wars doesn't exist, all right? Afghanistan, Iraq, from 2001 all the way through to, just a couple of years ago, continuous war. Billions and billions and billions and billions, let alone thousands of lives that were lost. And I think there's a certain view in people that they say, look, we're all in to defend Ukraine, we're willing to do so, but dear God, not another forever war. And I think the assumption was that when basically the entire Western world is giving Ukraine everything from what to shoot, as well as the information about where to shoot, that we might be in a different place 12 months down the road with basically the collective brain, all bar the boots.
Yes, look, that's right. I mean, the pro-war people keep saying, look, it's up to Ukraine to decide when to negotiate. But the reality is the US is funding practically 100% of this war, and the Allies are providing 100% of the munitions. So at any time they could say, look, enough's enough. We're not going to do this anymore. And then, of course, Ukraine would have to negotiate. So I think that's a false argument. But the sad thing for me about this war is there's so much propaganda. I mean, it's almost as bad as COVID. I mean, propaganda from governments basically saying that Ukraine's about to win. I mean, if you'd read the papers, the last 500 days, you'd always think that Putin's about to pass out and die, or Russia's about to collapse under the weight of sanctions. And of course, none of those things have remotely happened. And Ukraine was given so much false hope, I thought, with this counteroffensive, which just logically, from first principles, was always going to be completely insane. I mean, its neighbour is much, much more powerful and larger. It's right on the doorstep. The idea that Ukraine can break through those defences easily and puncture that land bridge, I think is just mad. Well, but that's what most people thought, and of course it never happened.
Yeah, well, these were the same people that said, Iraq, liberators, all the rest of it. But, of course, that machine, it just keeps pumping on, and they got all their talking points, and there's plenty of cuddles if you want to keep giving the machine what it wants, and plenty of cold shoulder if you don't. Last one before we finish. Axios had an interesting insight from a collection of people who work for Biden. Surprise, surprise, all of the touchy-feely stuff, and I mean literally touchy-feely sometimes, well, he's quite the crank behind the scenes. Now, rather than getting into the gossip of what he said and when, for the first 3 years, you didn't hear a sound from inside that White House. Now they're taking you right into the heart of how he behaves in the Oval Office. That's the story.
Yes, look, it's very interesting. I think the knives are really out amongst normally friendly journalists and friendly press. It's been quite stark in the last week or so, not just the Axios piece about his anger, but there's been pieces in the New York Times and in the Atlantic basically calling for him to stand down. And just a day or two ago, the most extraordinary one actually was the volume of leaking to CNN, which wrote a huge essay that basically said multiple people in the White House don't even think that Biden is going to run again. You know, that's quite a striking statement. These are multiple sources saying this, and indeed, if you look at the lack of staff in the campaign team, you know, that's a fact. And also the fundraising that they just put out, $72 million in the second quarter. That sounds like a lot, but Barack Obama about 8 years ago got 86 million, and there's been a lot of inflation since then. So really, that's a much poorer result. There's not the momentum there. So there's a number of things you can look at that suggest. Indeed, I've written this in the Australian. I don't think Biden will be the candidate. I think at some point at the end of this year, early next year, he changes his mind. But you know, that's obviously remains to be seen. But yeah, look, it's not looking good.
Well, and all the while, you know, Gavin Newsom just sort of parading around like, hey, look at this grass that's greener over here. I've got the fake teeth. I've got the car salesman look just like Joe, but I won't be, performing weird acts like he did in Europe. And I'll get to that in a second. Thank you very much, Adam. We'll keep reading you in the Oz.
Thanks, Paul.